Hi, Howard.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Okay, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is an episode of Worldwise. And you are Howard Amos. You write for the Moscow Times, and you are in Russia at this moment. But you have another relevant credential. We're going to be talking about this adoption issue, the fact that Russia has banned the adoption of Russian children by Americans. And as it happens, you worked in a Russian orphanage for a year at an earlier stage in your career, I gather. So you're very well positioned to tell us about this story. Now, I gather, just to make sure people understand the essentials of this, the bill that was passed in Russia's legislature was explicit retaliation for an American piece of legislation, right?
Yeah, that's correct. It was well, the package of legislation as a whole has been called the Dima Yakovlev law after this Russian toddler who died. He was adopted by a U.S. couple and who died 2 years ago. It is the whole bill is an explicit retaliation against the Magnitsky Act, which was passed and by Congress and signed by Obama into law earlier this year, which introduces visa bans and asset freezes on a group of Russian officials who are deemed to have been involved in the death of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a Russian lawyer working for a U.S. hedge fund firm in Moscow, and was uncovered a tax scam and was subsequently imprisoned and died in prison. Wasn't treated properly.
Having uncovered government malfeasance, apparently.
Yeah, he uncovered a huge tax scam.
Right.
Yeah, and that was. Yeah.
And the American legislation, I gather, I mean, first of all, it's largely a bill for normalizing trade relations, I think, but it did have this human rights dimension, and it targeted any Russian deemed to be complicit in the violation of human rights, right? Although it's named after this one case, it in principle had broader application.
Yes. There is a specific list of individuals associated with the Magnitsky case, who it applies to. But it does, as far as I understand it, it does also have broader significance. So I think it could theoretically be expanded to include others accused of human rights abuses.
Okay, and this got Prime Minister Putin, or is he President Putin now? He keeps trading jobs with Medvedev, and I get mixed up. Who is which right now?
He's president as of March this year.
As of March, he went from Prime Minister to President.
May, I take it back. May this year, he was inaugurated.
Okay. And this offended him greatly, and I gather offended people more broadly, because after all, the retaliatory bill that bans the adoptions was passed in the parliament. So I gather that Russians in general is it the case that they were in general upset by this and in general approve of this adoption measure as retaliation?
Yes, as with a lot of these things, specifically for the adoption part of the legislation, there is widespread support for it, particularly in rural areas and outside of the big urban cities where Russia's sort of small middle class is concentrated. There is a lot of fear about and a lot of anger about Russian children being sent abroad, and there are a lot of rumours about sort of child trafficking and trafficking of organs.
Okay, so
circulate. Yeah.
so adoption had been a sensitive issue all along before America passed this legislation. And in fact, I think there's an odd feature of Russian adoption law going back a ways, which is that for 7 months or so, for the first 7 months, a child cannot be adopted by, is it foreigners in general or Americans or something? I mean, there's a period during which they wait and try to find a Russian home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. There are restrictions already in place. I can't remember all of the exact details, but there is certainly for children have to be looked at, considered for adoption by Russian families and then subsequently rejected by those families for them to become eligible for adoption by foreigners, including Americans.
Okay, but American adoption in particular had become an issue now and had been one for some time, I gather. I mean, I know there was a case where a Russian child who had been adopted by an American died in a car one of those things where the windows had been left rolled up on a hot day. And then there was a case where a woman got sick of her adopted child and just put him on a plane back to Russia with a note saying, take him back, right? And those are the two well-publicized cases I read about. Yeah. Were those the source of this sensitivity in Russia about American adoptions, or was there something more?
Yes. I mean, those are the two sort of flagship cases which are always cited. And the case where the mother, the American adoptive mother, sent the child back on the plane, actually caused a temporary halt to all adoptions to the US. A subsequent special adoption treaty was negotiated, which came into force in November this year, which was supposed to regulate adoption much more closely. So this is definitely a long-running issue. I think the Russian authorities, Russian officials, say that Russian children adopted to the US, compared to other foreign countries, seem to be treated more badly, and in cases where there is abuse, the abusers tend to get off more likely. I'm not sure how much evidence there is for that, really. But also the US is obviously one of the biggest adopters of Russian children.
Well, and how much of this has to do with Russian suspicion of or dislike of America for other reasons?
Well, the ban on adoption, I don't think anybody would argue that it's a political move, and I think everybody from Putin from downwards recognizes that the decision to ban adoptions is political. So actually, since the elections earlier this year, there has been a marked upswing in the sort of anti-American rhetoric from top Russian officials, including Putin himself. The idea of there needing to be an external enemy to unify support within the country.
So is that a consequence of Putin's own political weakness?
I think many would argue that it was. But it's a recurring theme in Russian history, but its marked upswing in the last year, I think, has very much been linked to his weakening internal support, domestic support.
Okay. Now, I think one thing you're hearing in the American reaction to this is that it's particularly unfortunate because, if what I'm reading is true, conditions in Russian orphanages are particularly bad, and so it's a shame to consign these children to a longer stay there than is necessary when there are willing and eager parents awaiting them. What is the story on Russian orphanages? I mean, I think you were in an orphanage when you worked in an orphanage for a year. That was one kind of out in the hinterlands. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. It's about 800 kilometers from Moscow, in western Russia.
And what were how would you characterize the place?
Well, the orphanage where I worked was an orphanage for mentally and physically handicapped children. There are, without going into too much detail, there are 9 types of orphanages for children, ranging from sort of orphanages for sort of, as it were, healthy, ordinary kids to orphanages like the one I was, where the kids have quite severe physical and mental disabilities. And often those orphanages, like the one where I was, they were built in places that were deliberately out of the way, quite a long way from towns or big cities. This is obviously under the Soviet Union. They're all built to keep their inhabitants away from, out of sight. And that, although attitudes have changed and are changing, it still remains the case that a lot of these orphanages are not immediately obvious. They're deliberately hidden away.
And what were the conditions like in the orphanage?
Well, the first time I went to the orphanage was 5.5 years ago now, and I think it would be fair to say that, physically, in the material sense, conditions have improved, but not dramatically. And it has to be said that actually the material conditions in orphanages, in the orphanage where I worked, and as I understand in most orphanages, are dramatically better than 15 or 20 years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there were dramatic shortages of finance, and there were problems of getting very basic things, proper food for the kids and clothing, let alone teaching and so on. But now in the orphanage where I was, the material conditions are, although not ideal, they are, I think you could describe them as satisfactory. The real problem with these places is the lack of individual care and attention which the children receive, and a deficiency of trained staff, because obviously in very remote locations it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get trained staff, and a lack of programs encouraging, fostering and adoption to remove the children from the system.
Okay. I read there was an account, I guess it was in Tablet, the American website Tablet, by an American parent who had adopted 2 Russian children, who described, visited the orphanage, and described it in pretty severe terms. She said basically the children were completely passive, because they had learned that crying wouldn't get them anything. She said there were no toys. Mm-hmm. And this was not the kind of orphanage you worked in. I think it was not for handicapped children. And she said as a result, the kids just kind of stared blankly. Is that consistent with either your experience at the orphanage you worked at, or with your understanding of conditions in other ones?
That to me sounds probably fair description. You have to remember that institutions of this type, even if they are very well funded, still consistently fail to provide the individual attention that children would get in a family. And then of course there is always a tendency for the carers in charge to stick children in front of the television to watch the television, rather than thinking up sort of educational or developmental games for them to play, for example. And there is never going to be enough staff to provide one-to-one care and attention, even in the best orphanages. But I'd probably add that conditions in orphanages probably vary quite dramatically between those that are near Moscow and St. Petersburg, and probably relatively well funded and have access to some of the charities that work with orphanages, and the orphanage that you would find in the Russian regions, thousands of kilometers from Moscow, St. Petersburg, where there would be, I would assume, significantly less funding available and significantly less expertise.
And I mean, I should kind of confess that I actually have no idea what conditions are like at orphanages in America or any other country. They're kind of out of sight. And maybe you have a sense for how they are in England or anywhere else in the West. Is it your impression that in general they are really just quite a bit better than the kinds of things you'd find in Russia?
Well, I mean, kind of ironically, I know a lot more about the Russian orphanage system than I do about the British orphanage system. I'm from London myself. But right. As far as I understand it, the British system is much more focused towards family-based care. So a lot more money goes towards supporting families and fostering and adoption schemes. And you don't actually find the big orphanages that exist in Russia with hundreds of kids. You don't find those sorts of orphanage, those sort of places for children in Britain. It's much if kids are if they live together, it's rather they're in smaller units of 10, 20 or 30, or maybe less. Not the sort of huge Russian institutions which you get where there can be hundreds and hundreds of children in one building.
And it sounds like maybe also in Britain the goal is to make the stay in such institutions quite a bit shorter than it is or can be in Russia.
Exactly, yeah. Another point I would add is that the arguments for encouraging family-based care make a lot of financial sense, because to support a child in an orphanage is actually a very expensive task. For example, the orphanage where I worked, which is in a rural area, the average salary is about 6,000 or 7,000 rubles a month, which is approximately about $200. But the cost of keeping a child in this orphanage is 50,000 rubles, so over 10 times that. Over 5 times that, sorry. So it's an extraordinary amount of money to invest in keeping these children there. And experts say that to provide families with the proper financial support because often families, I should mention that in Russia, most of the orphans are what are called social orphans. So they have living parents, or they have living relatives. About 80 or 90% of Russians orphans have living relatives. So if more money is invested, if it's taken from supporting institutions and put into family-based care, then hopefully fewer parents and fewer relatives of these orphans fewer of them would refuse to raise the children themselves if they were supported financially and had the proper expert support. And how to deal with difficult children in many cases.
Okay. I'm curious, how did you come to be working at an orphanage there in Russia?
I actually, while I was at university in Britain, there was a charity which ran a summer camp at this orphanage, which was a group of British students and Russian students, British students who spoke Russian. And they ran this summer camp, which was a month of sort of activities and games for the kids in the orphanage. And my involvement with it just came out of that.
Okay, and do you know kind of what became of the kids there? I mean, how long did the average child spend there? How old was the average child when they were finally adopted? Did all of them get adopted, or do you have that kind of knowledge of the place?
Yeah, well, actually, what happens because most of the kids there all of the kids there are physically or mentally disabled. What happens is they, as a rule, when they turn 18, actually no, it's 21, they stay at those orphanages till they're 21. Most of them then go on to places called adult institutions, which are, again, institutions, and they look after people in society who can't look after themselves. So you have the very old there, you have the mentally ill, and you have some of these kids who, because they've spent their lives in institutions and they have no parents or family, they have no way of living independently. So they're transferred to these adult institutions where they live out the rest of their lives, which are often very short. So I mean, that's not. I mean, this is particularly true of orphans with physical and mental disabilities, but it's a very tragic future that awaits most of
Okay. Now, were adopted children from Russia thought of as having any tendency toward behavioral difficulty? I mean, I'm thinking of a kind of famous case. I think it's Romania, right, where a number of American parents adopted children from Romania and had really very severe developmental difficulties, and it turned out that the conditions in the orphanages had been, it had been a state of pretty extreme deprivation. So assuming I've got that story right, and correct me if you think I don't, was there anything like that associated with Russia?
Well, I would say that, I think most children that are kept in orphanages for any period of time will have some form of developmental delay. But it is certainly true that, because as we were talking about earlier, these restrictions on the children that can be adopted abroad, can be adopted by American families, that they have to be rejected by Russian families first. That means that there is a very significant proportion of the children adopted to America who are actually have some form of diagnosis of a developmental delay or mental or physical handicap to varying degrees of severity. So those sorts of children are disproportionately represented in those that are adopted to the US.
I see, because they by and large are children who have been deemed by prospective Russian adoptive parents as, for one reason or another, not desirable.
Yeah, and of course when Russia's population of orphans, kids up for adoption are much less popular, I think probably inevitably, if they have mental or physical handicaps in Russia. So they're much less in demand, as it were, amongst Russian families, which makes it easier or made it easier for American families to adopt them. And that's incidentally why the law has provoked the adoption ban has provoked so much outrage, because it will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable orphans, as it were, those with mental and physical handicaps who would otherwise stand no chance of finding a home in Russia. It may actually be worth pointing out that the orphanage where I worked, as this law was being formulated, I spoke to the director of the orphanage, and I asked her about the adoption issue, and she said a very interesting statistic, that throughout the time of that she's been involved in this orphanage, and I think at least for the last decade, perhaps forever, only 2 children have ever been adopted, and they were both adopted to the US, both last year, if I'm not mistaken, in 2010 or 2011. 2 little girls, I think aged about 4 or 5, and she said that the orphanage has never been approached by a Russian family looking to adopt. So she was saying
only 2. She was saying only 2 children had been adopted ever by anyone from her institution?
Yeah, that's correct, and both by US parents. I mean, it is worth qualifying with that kids, there are different ways of sort of removing kids from institutions in Russia. So there is fostering systems as well, and there are quite a few kids who have been taken under fostering systems or been taken temporarily by parents. But adoption, in the full sense of the word, which means the child legally becomes yours, your responsibility rather than the responsibility of the state. That's only happened twice in the history of her orphanage, and both times to the US.
Okay. So what are there any prospects now for this law being changed or rescinded, or is this just going to be the case for a long time to come?
I don't think there is any expectation that the law will be changed anytime soon. As I said, as we were saying earlier, this is a part of a series of what are perceived as anti-American measures. The U.S. USAID was closed down earlier in 2012, and the rhetoric amongst Russian politicians, the anti-American rhetoric, has markedly increased. So I don't think there is really any sense that there will be any backtracking on
now, was that also a response to this same bill, the same American bill with the human rights provision?
No, the closure of US aid was made before the Magnitsky Act was passed. It was a separate. It also feeds into, there's another Russian sort of narrative about Russia not wanting to be a recipient of aid. After the sort of economic and political collapse in the 1990s, when it received huge quantities of international aid and assistance from abroad, the last 5 or 10 years, very much a sense that Russia is now, or sees itself, is ashamed of what happened in the 1990s and would like to see itself as a world power standing on its own 2 feet, and does not want to receive aid. So the closure of USAID was very much linked to that. Also, it's worth noting that UNICEF, the UN's children's rights organisation, has also been closed. Its office in Russia has also been closed because Russia wants to become a donor of aid to the UN and to the international community rather than a recipient.
I see.
The fact that Russia is seen to give away children to the US is also seen as part of this. It's sort of a humiliating thing.
But there is, it sounds like, as the backdrop for this particular issue, an ongoing deterioration of relations between the U.S. and Russia, or is that putting it too strongly?
Well, there was great fanfare made of several years ago by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov about the reset in relations that was supposed to be going on between the two countries, which did for a while appear to be very much alive. And the US ambassador in Russia, Michael McFaul, is very much a proponent of that policy, and he is very active. But I think there is a definite sense that the reset is certainly stalled at the moment, if not dead in the water. And there is no immediate prospect of no sense that it's about to get started again.
And it sounds like it's driven, perhaps in part by the American Congress's tendency to favor things that antagonize Russia, but also within Russian politics, it sounds like there's almost an incentive for politicians to demonize America, especially politicians who perceive themselves to be politically weak.
Yeah, I do. I think that's fair. America is a very easy target, and taps into a long history of Cold War.
And what is the source of the popular antagonism toward America? Does it just go back to the Cold War, or what?
Well, yeah, as I said, I think it very much goes back to the Cold War, which appeals. That sort of message appeals to older citizens, older people in Russia. But as I said, I think it's also linked to this idea of Russia embarrassed by and humiliated by the experience of collapse in the 1990s and seeking to reverse some of the trends that were set in place then, and project itself as a world power again.
Okay, but in any event, there's been no significant popular backlash against this adoption law. In other words, there's not a lot of people standing up and saying you're being cruel to these disabled children who would otherwise have homes.
There has been some popular backlash, particularly in the cities. I mean, and some people in particular have been very vocal about how this is Russia is simply inflicting a tragic fate on its own children in retaliation for this measure passed by Congress, and is shooting itself in the foot and only harming itself, and that children shouldn't be politicized in this way. But these protests are very much, it has to be admitted, restricted to the big urban areas and the middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, for example, there was a protest one morning outside the Russian Duma, Russian Parliament, by people lobbying the deputies in Parliament about this law, but it doesn't have any mass appeal outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, I could also draw on my own experience in this at the orphanage where I worked, and absurd as it may sound to us, the people who work there genuinely believe that when these two children, which I talked about, when they were adopted to America, that they might well become the victim of child abuse,
really,
or that they are, have their organs trafficked. There is a very deep vein of fear and suspicion about what happens to children adopted abroad.
So it sounds like, kind of long-standing suspicion of America had made people very receptive to stories about American abuse or neglect of children adopted from Russia. And so, they'd gotten kind of a distorted idea of what happens to adopted kids who come to America. So the context was just kind of set for something like this bill to happen.
Absolutely. And I think, Russian media have consistently have consistently reported widely on any instances of cruelty towards Russian children in America. It's a very emotive issue, and a lot is written about it, and a lot is shown about it on television. So people are very aware of the things that go horribly wrong, but there is a lot of ignorance about the numbers of successful adoptions.
Mm-hmm. So a story of an adopted Russian child in America being abused is probably going to get more airtime than a story about an adopted Russian child in Russia getting abused.
Absolutely, no question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, before we go, can you just tell us a little about the Moscow Times, which you write for, which I gather is that kind of the main English language newspaper and website in Russia?
Absolutely, yes. It's not the only English language news publication, but it was set up in the early 90s and is an independent organization, unlike a lot of Russian media. And we write about, we cover most aspects of Russian business, politics, and culture. And it's a daily newspaper as well. So you can physically read it if you're in Moscow, but the website is also, I think, probably the go-to news source about Russia, and comprehensive news source about Russia in English.
So your main audience is English-speaking people who live in Russia.
That's the main
web.
That's the main audience, but the website also gets a lot of readership from abroad, so in Britain or America. But the Moscow Times is actually, surprisingly, when you talk to a lot of Russians, they all know the Moscow Times because most of them have been forced to read it in school as a tool of learning English language. So it also has quite a fairly high profile amongst Russians across the country.
Is English language instruction mandatory in the Russian schools from an early age?
Yeah, now I think every Russian child will have will be taught some English. Yeah.
Because it's the language of business in Europe, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And these days in Moscow and St. Petersburg, particularly because of the internet and in big cities, most people have a very good have a reasonable working knowledge of English. Often they're able to read and communicate in English fairly effectively. They may not be able to hold conversations because many of them have never met native speakers, but their level of English is.
But the Moscow Times is a private enterprise owned, I gather, has a Russian owner, and
no, it actually has it is a Russian company. It was actually set up by a Dutchman in the 1990s, but is now owned by a company called Sonoma Media, which is a Finnish media organization.
I see. So there's a fair amount of freedom. I mean, it's not something that the government has a lot of leverage over.
No. There are very over its 20-year history. I'm only aware of a couple of cases when there has been some sort of people have attempted to exert some sort of pressure over the editorial line. The Moscow Times is the company that Moscow Times is part of is it has one of Russia's biggest business newspapers called Vedomosti, which is a joint project between the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, and then it has lots of the glossy magazines such as Esquire, National Geographic, or Cosmopolitan, the Russian version of these magazines. So it is one of Russia's biggest media companies, and it has always been renowned for its independence. And because it doesn't have a Russian owner, it is much harder for political pressure to be.
And is the Moscow Times, does it seem to be profitable?
I'm not sure of the exact figures. I mean, as with all print media, it's having a fairly hard time at the moment. But the website is developing fairly quickly, and it's actually a free newspaper in Moscow. It's you don't pay.
Oh, I see.
It pays it.
So it's advertising supported.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let you get back to writing stories for it. Thanks so much for taking the time, Howard, and I hope maybe down the road you'll have time to come talk with us again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Thanks.